Hello. Yeah. Everyone. So my name is Viv Richards. Thank you for coming to this session. As I mentioned in my quick clip, I'm a lead test engineer at Resolution, based in Wales in the United Kingdom. So today I'm going to be talking quickly about how manual testing isn't enough. We're going to look at some common issues with end-to-end UI testing. There's going to be a brief introduction to what visual testing is. We're going to look at some common pitfalls with it, and then look at ways to try and overcome them. I will be showing code snippets of a framework that I've been building where I work, but it's on GitHub if anybody's interested. It's very rough and ready, just as a sort of proof of concept. But a lot of the techniques and things we'll talk about today, you should be able to apply to any type of framework. So why automate end-to-end UI tests? Well, it can be more reliable. Obviously, it depends on who's writing the tests and what you're checking. But because it's being performed by tools, it does tend to be a lot more reliable than humans. And as it's executed by tools, it can be significantly quicker than humans. But there are some common UI automation issues. So investment is required. And that's not just to be able to buy a tool or framework. It's actually training people and getting people on board. So in my current employer and previous employer, we've spent a lot of time in trying to get people on board from moving just from manual testing to try and start to use test automation to try and automate a lot of the sort of tedious and repeated steps. And it's only a practical option as well when you're repeating the steps. So if you're just trying to do something just to throw some data into a database so you can start your testing, and it's just a throwaway test, then you're probably not going to want to spend an awful amount of time invested in trying to create lots of tests. And I guess depending on the types of tests that you're writing, it doesn't really matter at this point until you start looking at visual testing. So typical end-to-end UI tests, it does not entail human observation. So you may be able to say that something exists somewhere, but it's not going to be able to tell you whether it's actually displayed in the place you expect, and it's the right color, font size, and that type of thing. And it can be a slippery slope. So I've seen this way too many times, whereby I've joined a company, or I've spoken to friends working at companies, and just because they can do something, they will do it. So I see a lot of people moving, again, into writing tests for end-to-end UI, and what they do is they'll pick up something like Selenium, and they'll think, right, this is great, and they start writing lots and lots of tests. And after a few months, maybe a year, you start to look back, and they've written tests for absolutely everything just because they can. And the problem with this is that when you start writing lots of tests just because you can, you're building up all this sort of technical debt. You're building up all these frameworks which you're going to have to try and maintain. And it's going to take lots of time when things change to try and keep up with that, and to also get people on board with trying to write automated tests as well. So this is the inverted testing pyramid. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with this, but I'll just cover it quickly in case. So what this illustrates is typically you'd see, and we'll see in a few slides' time, the lower down the pyramid, in this case inverted pyramid, the tests tend to be a lot quicker to execute. They're a lot cheaper to implement and maintain. And as you then go up through the pyramid, the tests become a lot slower to execute, and the tests become a lot more expensive to try and implement and maintain. At the very top, you've always got this sort of bubble or cloud. So regardless of what things throughout the stack that you try to automate, you're always going to have to, or hopefully you'll always want to, manually and exploratory test your applications, because it doesn't matter how good your tests are. They'll only do what you tell it to check. You're still going to want human eyes on it to be able to actually test boundary cases and edge cases. And I see this quite a lot as well. So some of the companies I've worked for, they tend to have very few unit and integration tests. And when you start speaking with the test teams and the automation teams as to why this is, you find that the testers, rather than, well, it's not just the testers, it's developers and testers, rather than just communicate and actually start having discussions to say, how can we start pushing the test further down the stack? The people who can with the tools, so with Selenium, for argument's sake, what they'll do is they'll just start automating end-to-end tests just to try and cover every sort of variation. So I've seen people, rather than just doing like a happy path test through a website, They'll test all the sort of business logic. So if you imagine like a shopping cart, they'll start to write Selenium UI tests for various different things, adding, removing, lots of different sort of checks, logic checks, which you could start to do in other layers of your testing pyramid. So you can start to get the feedback quicker, because UI tests, if you've written them before, you'll know that they take a very long time to run, and they're very difficult to maintain. So teams that I've worked on, we've had discussions, and we've said, well, look, we've identified we need to start pushing tests further down the stack. The feedback that we're getting is just too slow, because it's not unusual, or I have seen a lot of tests whereby teams have written so many UI tests that we work in 2-week sprint cycles. So we're an agile team. So every 2 weeks, we'll run through all our automated tests. And we do tend to have a lot more UI tests than any other layer. It'll take up to 4 hours before the tests will all run end to end to give us any feedback, which isn't quick enough. So the teams, they start having discussions and think, right, we need to get tests further down the stack, which is great. And they start writing lots of UI unit tests, which is very good. But the problem is, even if you've got, near 100% test coverage for the unit tests, if you don't have integration tests, how do you know those units, those components work well together? So you need to ensure that you're getting a full flow through the system, and you've got a sort of a distributed sort of flow, like the testing pyramid. And it's something I like to call fragile testing. So if you've got tests that take too long to execute and give you feedback, how can you change? The whole thing with Agile is you need to be able to adapt, and you need to be able to fail fast. But when your tests take too long to execute and give you that feedback, it's just not good enough. So this is the testing pyramid, and this is an adaptation of Martin Fowler's testing pyramid. So this is the ideal. There's a lot of discussion and disagreement with this. I quite like it. I'm happy to talk to anybody in the speaker's corner afterwards if you want to discuss this further. So this is what I quite like. So you tend to have more unit tests at the bottom, then service integration tests, and then a very thin layer of UI tests at the top. So these are the sort of things where we'll just get sort of happy paths through the system using something like Selenium. And at the very top then, we still have a lot of manual and exploratory testing. One of the ways as well that we've tried to sort of push the tests further down the stack is that we work with WIP limits. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with those. So work in progress limits. So within our work sprints, so we work in 2-week cycles. For example, if we bring in 10 stories into our sprint to deliver that sprint, if there's 5 people on a team, we'll say, well, our WIP limit is 5. So you can only work on one thing. So you're trying to get stories over the line as a team rather than everybody just picking up lots of different stories. And you may be thinking, well, that probably wouldn't work on my team because, I'm a tester. Developers tend to pick up lots of work, or if I've run out of work, what am I going to do with my time? Well, people are going to be waiting. Well, it's an ideal situation to start pairing up. And again, you may be thinking, well, what value can I offer pairing up with a developer? And likewise, a developer may be thinking, well, what value is a tester going to give pairing with me? Well, there's an awful lot because, for yourselves as testers, you may think, well, I don't have, the programming skills or knowledge. I know very little about that. But what you do have is domain knowledge. And what testers tend to have is a lot more domain knowledge of the overall systems than developers. So you have an awful lot to offer. And likewise, developers, if you start pairing with them, you can start looking at the unit tests and identifying test cases that perhaps they haven't covered in the code that they're trying to unit test. And you can start then creating these checks further down the stack. So you're going to get, as part of your sort of build pipeline, the more unit and integration tests you get, you can start to fail faster rather than relying all the way to the end of the sort of continuous integration pipeline whereby you've run very few unit tests, very few integration tests, you've deployed, and then you run the UI tests. You need to try and fail quicker. So why not just stick to manual testing then? Because what manual testing does give, it allows us to we've got human observation, we can actually see when things don't quite look right. But the problem is, it's time intensive, especially if you do work as part of an agile team. there seems to be meetings every 5 minutes. You've got stand-ups every morning. You've got 3 amigos. You've got refinements. You've got retrospectives. There's just always something. And similar to developers, it's very difficult sometimes to try and context switch, and it can take you 15, 20 minutes to try and get back into what you're doing. So it can be really time intensive, especially with all the distractions as well, where we try to have co-located teams. It's not accurate all the time as well. With all these distractions, it's easy to make mistakes. We all have our own biases. It's easy to just sort of gloss over 1 or 2 things that you assume is right. And it's only practical as well when you're only running the test you only run the test cases once or twice. If you're starting to want to run the test cases more than once or twice, you may start to look, well, how can I start to write that test in an automated way? Because if you're doing that over and over again, it just doesn't make business sense. And it can be quite frustrating as well. So the company that I work in now, before I joined, they'd spent a lot of time in trying to create a framework because we identified that we needed to start moving testers to drive them forward so they could start to automate a lot of the tasks that they were repeating daily. So they created this massive framework. But even when we tried to give the wheels for the cart, they just didn't have time to stop. It was just a constant battle trying to get them on board. And the problem is, it's a catch-22 because they never had time because they didn't automate. But they never automate because they didn't have time. And so it's about trying to break that cycle. And it's working as a team. It's not the tester's job or sole job just to try and get things over the line. We're all a team trying to deliver quality and trying to get the stories across. We all want to feel that we've achieved something and we've sort of, delivered something for that sprint. So we should all be trying to help each other. But it can be quite tricky because when you start looking at, getting into test automation, unless there's something already sort of predefined, like a framework or tools, there's just so many options, and these are just a very few of them. So, and it really depends as well on lots of different things like operating systems. So will you be developing and testing on Windows or Linux? Languages. So are your developers using C#? Or the testers, what languages are they familiar with? It's probably a wise idea to try and stick to the same languages as the developers, just so you can try and get support. Application types. So are you concentrating on things like, so we've got Slendroid up there. So is it an Android application? Is it, Robotium, again, for mobile? Visual Studio, coded UI. So if you don't want to write code, or if you don't feel comfortable in writing code, Visual Studio allows you to load up the application, execute a few steps, and it's got a recorder which will record the steps for you. But there are some drawbacks with some of these, as in browser support. So, for example, Visual Studio coded UI may only let you play back your tests in Internet Explorer. One really good one I haven't really used that much, but from the little bit that I have, Appium. So what this allows you to do is, if you write your tests in Selenium, you can, with very few sort of changes, you can start to point your applications, your tests, for your application, at Android and iOS devices. So at Appium, you just install it. It's a little server. It's free. Install it. Your tests just point to this address rather than at your website address. And then it routes through, and you can all of a sudden start extending the sort of support that you've got then for your applications. There's also cost as well. Some of these aren't free. And even if they are free, it's also the cost to your business to try and get people on board and learn these tools or frameworks, because a lot of these as well will come with a lot of sort of bloat. So it's trying to sort of get away from the noise and actually see what value it's giving you. So we use Selenium. There were a few reasons why we chose Selenium. Initially, it was because it was open source, so we could see exactly what it was doing. If we wanted to make some commits or to change the way in which it worked, then we could. It's very well documented. There's a great community support there as well. It can operate in almost any operating system, and the languages that it supports as well are really great. For us, we develop in MVC.NET, so C#, and it covered that. And also the browser support. So we have to cover Chrome, IE, and Firefox for our customers. But again, there are things, Selenium is so popular that you can actually extend it with third-party tools. So you can start to look at then iOS, Android, and other types of driver types. One thing I would mention though is that You have to be careful, because if you do set out with something like Selenium, I've seen quite a few times whereby people have picked Selenium for these reasons, but as they start to develop their own frameworks and helpers and things to try and make it easy for testers to get on board, the problem is you start moving away from the sort of raw Selenium, and all the sort of things like the big community support, you lose that because all of a sudden you've got your own framework and you've got to maintain this thing as well. And we'll see quite quickly it can grow into quite a monster. And it's not a silver bullet. What I would say is, if you're thinking about using it, obviously if you've already used it, you felt the pain. But if you're thinking about using it, just be careful and just try to use it sparingly. Try to automate, your happy paths. Don't get too carried away with things just because you can do it. Just sort of do the bare minimum just to meet the sort of happy path requirements, and think, can I start to push the test further down the stack? Talk within your teams and see if you can actually, add tests at another level to give you the quicker feedback. So if you've used Selenium, or if not, you'll know that there's a lot of sort of browser compatibility issues. So we have to support these 3 browsers, Firefox, Chrome, and IE. And the problem is they execute at different speeds. So when you start trying to take account of lots of different browsers that you have to support, it can become quite sort of a maintenance hell, you sort of code for your tests, because you have to start saying, well, if I'm in this driver type, then do this. If I'm in this driver type, do this. You have to start looking at things like weights, so you have to start slowing down the page because an element hasn't loaded in IE, but it has in Firefox. You have to then start adding all this bloat in. So quite quickly it can grow into quite a sort of a mess that you have to then try and maintain. And it doesn't really matter for, I guess, typical end-to-end testing, but when it comes to visual testing, browsers render differently, and that causes a big problem. So execution speed, I touched on it a bit earlier. I've seen tests whereby just for one little suite, it can take up to 15 minutes. I've also seen tests whereby with all of the Teams suites put in, it can take up to 4 hours. And it's not quick enough. You need to try and fail fast. So as I mentioned, maintainability, it can become quite a painful process. If you've ever experienced this, you'll know. When you start adding weights and things, and when you start sort of thinking, what browser am I in? How do I interact with this element? Some driver types allow you to do a find element by id.click. Some you may have to do assign keys.enter, and they do differ very slightly, and you have to cater for all these different things. So I wanted to ask, how valuable are these tests? So apart from end-to-end functional tests, how valuable is this? If you're not looking at localization for your tests, what are we doing here? We're actually just checking some text on a page. And it's quite likely, if you're writing your test early on, arguably you shouldn't be if you do an end-to-end test, because it can be quite flaky. But if you just write in, what's this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7 lines of code just to check some text, how valuable is that? So there was a call one Friday into the support room whereby a customer was unable to proceed through the application, and the support clerk couldn't quite work out what had happened. She checked the Team City log. She could see everything was green. She went to the DevOps team, asked if she could look at the tests. They checked, everything had passed. What had actually happened was that the test rightly passed, because what Selenium did was it said, can I find these elements somewhere within the document object model? And it could. It was great. But the problem was that someone had actually done a CSS change and checked it in, and all of a sudden the send button was hidden behind another element. So the page was unusable to the end customer, but the test had done their job. So just quickly before we look at visual testing, I just wanted to share just a few things quickly that could save you a bit of pain if you're starting to look at automation. So to try and make tests less flaky, there's page object patterns. So there was a talk earlier beyond Selenium. So mentioned there about trying to move your tests to the client side and looking beyond Selenium. And one of the things I'd say is, if you are looking at something other than Selenium, page object patterns. So it was mentioned again in the talk that you may want to move away from React to Vue.js. If you move to page object patterns, the way in which you interact with elements, because it's still using WebDriver, will still be the same. It's just the framework is different, so it'll make it a lot easier to manage your tests. So the way that it works is that there's more information, probably better explained as well by Martin Fowler on the blog post. But if you find you're writing many tests and you're interacting with the same elements, if that element ID changes, all of a sudden you have to update all these tests because they're all going to fail. But if you extract out the way that you interact with that element out to a page helper object, all of a sudden you're only then updating in one place the new ID or the class, and all your tests, because they reference that object, they're going to pass. Another thing is QA selectors. So you may know them as data selectors, and there's a big debate on whether they should be in the QA selector or data selector. But what they actually are is that, so if you imagine we've got the submit button here. So typically you'd see the code at the top whereby it could just be any sort of markup, but there's nothing really special about it. But when you're starting to write tests, it can be quite painful because for some reason teams don't seem to communicate, even though they work probably co-located together. So what you find is that developers will go off and they'll create a web page, and they'll reuse the same class name, or depending on the tool that they're creating the front end with, if it's not just like a raw view or HTML, perhaps it's a generated ID. So all of a sudden the way in which you try to interact then with elements can become quite painful, and you may have to find a class within a class, or it can be quite painful. So what you can do is, for this submit button, you can add a QA hyphen button, because that's the type, and then you give it the name, so it's a submit button. For cancel, QA button, cancel. And you don't litter these throughout your page, you only put them where you're going to go through your happy path of your test. And what this does is, it promotes discussion with you and your developers. They can see there's a QA tag on that element, so they're less likely to make breaking changes because they can see if they go to change something around that element, it's got a QA tag on it. And also when you start to write your tests as well, all of a sudden you don't have to think, well, should I be finding this element by ID? Should I be looking at class, CSS selector, tag name, or really dirty XPath? You just always find it by CSS selector because you know you've put that tag in there and you know it's going to exist. And if it doesn't, it's likely there's been a breaking change, and then you can go and check your continuous integration, whether it's, I don't know, TeamCity or Gitblit or whatever. So I'd really recommend having a look at that. So to try and keep you awake, I know it's been quite a day so far, we're going to play a little game. So what we're going to see is there's two images. On one side, you're going to see some differences. On the other, you're not going to see any. So we're going to have 30 seconds and see how many you can find. Okay, so could you put your hands up if you found 2? Can you keep them up if you found 3 or 4? 5 or 6? I will be asking and checking. 7? Okay, excellent. I wouldn't really be checking. So there are 11 differences. I appreciate, because of the contrast, some of these things can be quite difficult to find. So just quickly going through them then. We've got, at the very top, an image. This would never be picked up using typical Selenium end-to-end testing. A style change, again, for the selected element link. And again, some text, some padding, an image, the number changed on seats. I'm struggling to see that from here, so I don't think you'd see that, but some padding again, color, text, and padding. So there were 2 images, 3 text, and 6 style changes. Only 3 of these would be picked up normally. And for some businesses, this can be critical, depending on the type of business that you're working in. And the problem is, how do you know when you found them all as well? It can be quite a task. So how can we start adding value then to the top of the stack? How can we start automating some of the manual checks? So this is where visual testing comes into its own. So what if we could say then, I want to assert, I've got this base image of how my website should look, or this page should look. And every time I run my test, I want to be able to quickly launch a WebDriver, take a snapshot, and compare it and say, does this look how I expect? So again, no different to Selenium. There's quite a few less options, but there are still quite a few. And what I'd advise is, you probably want to do some spikes in your sprint, so don't just jump into something because it initially feels right. You want to try and see the pros and cons and weigh everything up, because what you're going to find is as soon as you start, investing time and getting a bit of momentum, it's likely going to end up continuing down that path. So try and weigh up all your options before you sort of, try and put your eggs all in one basket. Again, when you're looking at these frameworks, it really depends on lots of things. So some of these are free. So you've got Phantom, CSS, Wrath, Backstop. They're on GitHub. Wrath is a BBC tool. Some of them charge, so Percy charges. Ghost Inspector is free for 100 runs, and then they start charging. Screenster is free, but only for one concurrent test. So one really good one is Apply Tools. So there's, again, the leveling up from Selenium talk. There was a mention of AI and testing, and there was a question around it. So Apply Tools, unlike all of the others, uses AI to do comparison. So why this is really powerful is you can write code to write your tests, or they've got a nice GUI, so you can just drag around areas of interest. The other things it can do is, if you imagine you had 2 Twitter streams, and the content was the same, but in slightly different order, it knows that it's the same content. So you can set a tolerance and you can allow certain things. They actually as well, they do third-party integration. So it was released, I think yesterday possibly. They tweeted that you can now use Storybook and Cypress.io with this. So it's really powerful. And if you get time, check it out, because it's definitely more advanced than what I'm going to show today. But some of the techniques I'm going to show, you should be able to apply to any of this. So the issues with other offerings for us was that they didn't work straight out of the box. There's a massive learning curve, especially for people still trying to get onto sort of test automation. Small community, so visual testing, it's been around a while, but only now it seems to be picking up momentum. And it needed to work with our current framework, because we'd invested so much time in the UI framework with Selenium. We needed it to just sort of piggyback off the back of it, really, and not have to be another steep learning curve for testers. And costs. We're still trying to get buy-in from the business. I've been working on this for probably 14 months. And it's still trying to prove its value before we start to look at things like Apply Tools. So yeah, it's been in development quite a while. And probably the biggest challenge has been the fact that it's just been myself working on this, trying to sort of prove that it is something that could replace a lot of the checks. So where we had the slide where we were checking the text, what we're trying to do is look at these types of tests, strip them out, and then replace them with the visual checks, because all of a sudden we're not just getting, was the text the same? We're getting, was it the right font size, the right font? Was it the right padding, colors? So we're trying to get a lot more value out of our tests and keep maintenance down for our frameworks. This was an image taken with Google Chrome driver on the Google homepage, and one of the things we found straight away was that we wanted to use one base image for all our drivers that we had to support, so Chrome, Firefox, and IE. But they all render differently. So the pink boxes you see above, what that's actually showing is this is where it thought there were differences, even though there were none. Execution speed. Okay, so it's not showing on here, is it? Okay, so what that showed us that we had a base image, and it went off, it loaded a WebDriver window, it took a snapshot, it did the comparison, and in 4 seconds, it passed. So that's how quick it can be. But before anybody gets too excited and starts thinking, well, actually, this is going to, cut bags of time off our tests, if you've got an application where you have to log in, and you have to do all these sort of pre-steps, you'd still have to do this before you could take the snapshot to do the comparison. So you've still got to think about, you've still got all that legwork as well. We're going to play another game. So what I wanted to do was to try and prove to the business that this was quite a quick thing. So what I've got here is Where's Wally, or Where's Waldo, some of you may know it as. He's going to be in one picture, and he's not going to be in the other. So I want to see how quick you can find him. And these are the exact two images that we gave. We'll zoom in a little. A little more. Anybody? Excellent. So he's hiding up in the top corner. So this is the problem. When there's a lot going on, some of the web applications that we deal with on a daily basis, there can be a lot going on, and it's quite difficult to try and digest everything and sort of, pick out these little things that are sort of wrong. So the machine was 293 milliseconds, based off the very two large images we give it. And all we had to do was say, here's my base image, here's my other image, do a comparison, let me know if there's any differences. So maintainability, this was the code that we had before, and it was a number of lines just to try and check some text. Using the helpers for this framework, and other frameworks are very similar, what we can do is to specify the image, say this is the URL I want to go to, were there any differences? So all of a sudden we're getting a lot more value out of our test because we're getting colors and layouts and things. But it's easier to maintain as well. And you can take it further. So does anybody use SpecFlow here? Have you heard of it? A couple of hands. So if you haven't used SpecFlow, definitely check it out. So if you work as part of an agile team, when you start to create your acceptance criteria of how the story should be met, what you can do is you can create these scenarios. What you do with these is you paste in your given one thens, and these generate then these sort of code stubs that link up. So what we've done is we've added the helper code here. We pass in the base image, which is the grey sort of text, and we can create lots of these different scenarios, but this code will never be duplicated. That's all the code you'll see. It'll just be duplicated no matter how many scenarios we add. You can take it further. You could just add one scenario and then add a scenario context, it's called. You should type it in Google if you're interested. And you can have a table whereby you'd have this information and you can just loop through the stories and your base images, but using the same code. So this is the images that you get back. So it'll show the pink boxes are whereby they found differences. You can also get it to give tolerance. So the numbers on the right-hand side are where the pixels differed quite a lot. It can be pixel perfect. It depends on how many different machines you want to run this on. And the image quality difference is the same because you're using the same drivers, no matter what device you run it on. There's been a lot of challenges so far. So maintaining base images, you have to, whatever browsers you want to support, you have to take base images in them browsers. Screenshots, as a standard, it's a W3C standard. It'll only take what's in the viewport. But with these frameworks, you can actually get down to the element level if you want to. So if you don't want the bigger picture, you can just say, are all my buttons the same? Screen resolutions. So I got caught out with this, whereby I was basically maximizing my WebDriver window before running my tests. Just set a height and width, don't maximize them. So whenever it takes the base images, it's always going to be the same height and width. Responsive design. If you care about that, what you can do is you can set up profiles. You can get the WebDriver to launch in different heights and widths. And you can start then to take base images for the different sizes. One of the biggest things you'll see issues with visual testing, or pixel by pixel, which is what I'm showing now, is that based on the hardware that's being used, if I write the tests and check them in, my colleague next to me runs the tests, if the hardware differs in any way, you'll get issues. So you'll get anti-aliasing issues, whereby things may look right to the human eye, but they differ very slightly. So a way around that is you could actually move the code onto a Docker image. So it's the same image, always taking the comparison images, and then you shouldn't then get these issues. Storage, we haven't had really that many issues with this, but every time the tests fail, they're going to create different images. Every browser you want to support, you're going to need to create a base image for it. So you need to start thinking about how many browsers do I want to support, because quite quickly things could get out of hand, and whereby you may not have a framework that you're now supporting. What you are going to have is a lot of base images to support. So you need to start thinking about it, how it's going to work for you. Dynamic content. A really quick and dirty way around this is that you can basically, we've created a helper, so we locate the X and Y, height and width of the element, and we just blanket over it. We take a snapshot, then take the base image. Every time we run the test, we just hide the dynamic content by using this helper. The other frameworks are exactly the same. Moving elements, through the driver you can inject JavaScript, you can stop CSS3 transitions, stop videos. And quite quickly, visually checking documents. The thing that's the most powerful for us is that we use a third party to load documents, and then we extract them to images. So all of a sudden we can check a 15-page PDF document in seconds, because we extract them to images, run it through the tool, and that could take, we support 4 different languages. It could take maybe 1-2 hours to check a document, and even then the tester's not 100% confident because they're not familiar with the language. It's easy to miss, an apostrophe or something. And PDF dynamic content, you can use regex. You can start to think, well, you can start replacing dates and things with knowns before you take the base images, so it can be quite quick. There's upcoming challenges. I'm aware that I'm running out of time. I'd love to take some questions. So if you want to hear more about these, I'll be in the speaker's corner. But these are what we're currently looking at, text only and layout only. Just because you've seen this today, don't just go off and use it. Of course, try it, but it may not work for you. Just don't use it just because you can. It's just another a tool possibly to add to your tool belt. Here's the GitHub repository, and there's a new Git package. If you pull it down, it'll install WebDriver, Chrome driver, and all the examples I've shown today, and you can get a feel for it. That's it. I'd love to take any questions. Thank you.